built for herself, and I think a very necessary career when it comes to South Africa. She goes by the name of Lydia. And I think, Lydia, I'd like you to introduce yourself to our listeners, and we'll take the conversation from there.
Pleasure to be here again. Sorry about that. I'm so excited. I'm jumping over my words. So my name is Lidia Rauch, and I work in what we call the EDI space, which stands for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, in corporate schools, NGOs, churches, you name it, wherever people have the need, I work. But my focus area has kind of become anti-racism with time, which I actually really enjoy. Of course, it's something that often makes people feel uncomfortable, but I believe that it's critical and necessary, specifically at this point in time in our country. But really work in that kind of space, in the EDI space, we call it. And then my field of expertise has become anti-racism. And my company's name is Bloom Enterprise. So if anyone is interested to find out more, you can always just Google Bloom Enterprise and you'll find all of my information there.
Lydia, thank you for pioneering this kind of work. It's not a lot of people that you find in this space, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say this, especially white females. So you
Mm.
are indeed a pioneer, and you are brave in doing the work that you're doing. This year, South Africa celebrates 30 years of democracy, and I would like you to ask you the question. How far are we when it comes to reconciliation, 30 years back to where we are now, thinking back of, everything that we went through. There was also the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened for us here in South Africa. Did that work? Was that, worthy of being used? So those are sort of the question that I'd like to hear from you, or your thoughts around that space of reconciliation.
Mm. This is such an important question and a topic that I feel so passionate about. If I could only do work around the reconciliation space, I would. To be honest with you, I don't think we have come as far as we need to as a nation. I think that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was an incredible model and a tool at the time. And I think that globally, so many other countries and nations look to us and to that example as really one of peacemaking, essentially. And I think at the time it was really very necessary. And I absolutely buy into the vision that Mandela and Desmond Tutu and others had at the time, when they led, well, I know Tutu led the commission, but it was kind of Mandela's brainchild.
Yeah.
And I think it served that purpose. But the if I reflect back, as I actually looked at the TRC quite a bit in my thesis, so I actually did my master's looking at the position of specifically young white Afrikaans-speaking women in more inclusive South African society, right? And what I found is that there is a reconciliation gap still in South Africa. And the reason that's there is because there's also a responsibility gap. And those two things hand in hand. And I think, so the TRC, to answer your question about that, and then I'll get to where we are now. I think the TRC was a really great model at the time and very necessary. But of course, because of the nature of post-apartheid South Africa, and especially at that time, immediate post-apartheid South Africa, it only dealt with almost like the most critical cases. And it only kind of, and of course, it was very political, right?
Yeah.
And it's great. But the vast majority of South African stories have not, right? Because if you think about an average South African of color that went through humiliation because of the system, right? That's also a valid thing that needs to be heard.
Yes.
But of course, not every single South African had the opportunity to appear. So the model is great, but I think the reconciliation gap still exists because there's a lot of owning up that hasn't happened. And when I say that, very like you said it, of course, I'm a white person. I do a lot of work with other white people where we look at racism and we actually call this white work because I think it is critical and important that we understand this. So especially when white people hear this, we kind of tense up because we're like, why are you saying I need to take responsibility for something I had no part in, right? And
Yes,
that's
that's
very
always the
valid.
conversation. Yeah.
That's always the thing, right? But if someone, as an example, and I mean, this is also a Christian radio station, right? If
Mm,
someone close to us passes away,
mm,
as an example, or their father or mother passes away, we would say, I'm really, really sorry. And I acknowledge that this is something horrible that
mm,
happened and they deserve that. And I'm genuinely sorry that you're going through that.
yeah.
um
Mm,
not taking I didn't cause this,
yeah.
but in the same way, what if we just acknowledged other people's lived experiences and the
Mm,
reality that our history very much still has an impact on our present,
mm,
right, in South Africa, because the system in itself takes much longer to change. Of course, we can point to government failures, there's many things we can point to and that we can shift blame, but we have to think about personal agency when it comes to this question around reconciliation.
yeah.
We can't only government, because real meaningful change on a societal level
Yeah.
actually kind of requires of each of us to take that personal responsibility and personal agency.
Mm,
So reconciliation, I don't think, is possible without responsibility, taking up responsibility. And if that responsibility is genuine, I
mm,
think the outcome becomes restitution, right?
mm,
So restitution, reconciliation also, again, kind of has to mean the same thing. And I
mm,
think PRC, unfortunately, didn't really, I know there was restitution to an extent,
mm,
but the restitution that was needed in this country didn't happen. And I don't
mm,
always think it is as intense as people imagine. If I think,
mm,
if we look at the example in Germany,
mm,
right, there's massive room for improvement. It's West European. We've got the global North versus South argument.
mm,
All of that I'm not into.
yeah.
But the one thing that I think is brilliant is it doesn't matter where you go in Germany.
Yeah.
It's a known fact that the Holocaust was an evil, that it's wrong.
Yeah.
They acknowledge it. They say the words. Why do we still sit in a country where some people don't want to say, I'm genuinely
Apartheid
sorry
was
about what
wrong. Yeah.
apartheid, that was really not okay. And I
Mm,
know that I'm not Hendrik Verwoerd, but I take responsibility for what my forefathers did.
yeah.
And that's really not okay. And I'm
Yeah.
really sorry that you're suffering because of that. I
Sure.
wish it wasn't the case. What can
Mm,
I do? Is there anything I can do
mm,
to not save you? Because again, that's also a trap that we can fall into.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
be better. You know what I mean? How can I take that humble position
Mm,
to try to genuinely see other people's lived experiences?
mm,
Not because I want to be a good person, just because it's literally the right thing to do. Just because if we genuinely believe
mm,
in Mandela's dream,
yeah.
then we have to understand we all have a role to play. We can't just be like, oh, this thing happened 30 years ago,
Mm,
moving on, because the system in itself, South Africa, shows us that
mm,
unfortunately, the majority of our country's lived reality has not changed.
yeah.
I mean, I just got back from KZN today. There's so
Mm,
many people in such extreme poverty in this
yeah.
country.
Dire need.
Cannot
Yeah.
ignore the fact that the
Mm,
vast majority of them are people of color. We can't ignore that
mm,
fact. And
mm,
we can't ignore the apartheid, unfortunately, in our history has so much to
the
do with. I
results.
know people hate that.
Mm.
But why do we feel comfortable? Sorry, I'm going to stop right here because I'm getting so excited about this topic. But the one thing I want to say, why do we feel comfortable to go to church every Sunday to speak about something very important that
Yeah.
happened 2000 years ago, but
Mm,
we feel uncomfortable to speak about something that happened 30 years ago in this country?
I hear you.
This very recent history.
Mm,
You know
mm.
what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Why do we want to see the lesson in the one thing, but we
Mm,
refuse to see the lesson in the other,
mm.
specifically as Christians?
Yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
you are
So,
right. I think there is a responsibility that we have as
yeah.
believers, as Christians. Um, now, I think as you were speaking, I was also even thinking about, it's also just acknowledging the privileges that you have, as a white person, and
Yes.
being comfortable in also having that conversation, like you're saying, acknowledging that okay, I do have certain privileges that people of color don't have, and what am I doing to raise my voice and almost to be an advocate for them as well. And I think that's something that you're doing brilliantly, Lydia. We're going to move on to a conversation now about diversity and inclusion in your space. And I think an overarching theme there is also belonging. So, what
Yes.
is belonging and what does belonging look like, in the workspace, at universities, so on and so forth?
Yeah. That's it. You know what? I feel like that's a question that is unfolding. That's an answer to a question that is unfolding and a very
Mm,
important one. So I kind of decide when people ask me this question to really just trust my thinking and not want to give a kind of textbook answer. So
Mm,
if I think about belonging, and the first time I really felt like I belong, that's one of the first memories of like being a child,
mm,
in my family where I felt safe.
mm,
That's genuine belonging, right?
mm,
That
mm,
genuine, that's like, I feel safe here. I'm comfortable. I belong in this space. I
mm.
can be me. I don't have to step into a version of myself,
Yeah.
right? If you think about inclusion, what that means is being genuinely comfortable to be ourselves and not a version of ourselves.
Mm,
Why I say that deliberately, and also on the previous kind of topic around race, a lot of not only race, I mean, I think this is true for in terms of gender, in terms of religion, in terms of sexuality, in terms of all identity markers. When we exist in an environment where we are not either the majority or we're not represented by the people with the most power. So if we think about, and I mean, this is not to throw shade at all, just literally looking at statistics. If we think about corporate South Africa, right? Even though it's much more diverse than it was in 94, which is wonderful, and we are happy about that.
yeah.
Even though it's much more diverse, what the environment still feels like
Mm,
for the vast majority of people that I work with is it still feels very white. It still
yeah.
feels very male. It feels very Christian. It feels very English typically. It feels like an environment where people that are able-bodied belong. It feels like an upper
Mm,
income environment. Those
mm,
kinds of things play a role in terms of the experience.
mm.
It feels like a male environment, like I said. So anyone that doesn't fit into, if I can call it a mold,
Yeah.
has to work harder to feel included, has to work harder to be comfortable. So that person then shows up often as a version of themselves that fits into this mold. So, as a practical example, I will make a joke about the rugby this weekend, although I don't watch rugby or I might not be interested, but that's what the dominant culture
Mm,
does, right?
mm, 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 mm.
Often
And you
we kind of
exclude it
make
if you don't get to the rugby joke.
exactly right. And I'm forced to kind of laugh at something that I don't understand because I want to fit in. And that's also part of being a human being, right? So that's
Mm,
okay.
mm.
But some of us have to almost constantly exist in
Yeah.
that state
Mm.
versus where some of us have the luxury of just showing up as ourselves and we never have to kind of extend ourselves
Shift.
to
Yeah. Mm.
and there's a very distinct difference between assimilation and inclusion.
Yeah.
And I think those of us that have the most power often can't see that difference. So if I
Mm.
hold the most power in a room
Mm.
that perhaps feels white and feels Afrikaans and feels whatever, then I won't see the difference because
Mm.
I'm not the one that has to become something else
Yeah.
in order to fit in,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So inclusion is genuinely, and genuine I mean when I say that, feeling like I can show up as who I am and not a version of me. And
Mm.
belonging means that that version will be fully accepted,
Mm.
right? It's not
Mm.
allowed,
Mm.
but
Mm.
it's embraced and
Mm.
accepted and celebrated, and I can feel safe in that space.
Mm.
So belonging to me still feels a little bit like utopia because I don't think we figured out the inclusion bit
Mm.
yet. And I think we're closer in some spaces. Like I do often work in environments where leadership of an organization takes it seriously.
Mm.
So it's not doom and gloom, but I think in general we still have to really figure out and become comfortable with the inclusion piece, and belonging is the thing we need to strive for. But I
Mm.
don't think we're quite there yet, if that makes sense.
Mm. Absolutely. No, I hear you. I love the fact that you say it's unfolding, it is almost
Yes.
like layered and, there's more talk about it and people are starting to be more aware, which is good.
Yeah.
There's progress. So, why would you say it's important for us to have conversations, to talk about diversity and inclusion in terms of the progression of South Africa as a democratic state?
Such a good question. Oh my word. Um, well, because difference, all diversity is difference,
Yeah,
right? That's literally what it is. It's the things that make us different. And
yeah,
you and I can spend 5 hours talking about all the things that make us different, and we still wouldn't have gotten to the bottom of the
yes,
list. But the truth is, when we think about difference, which is diversity, the things that we can see are the things that we ascribe value to,
yeah,
right? So if I
yes,
see someone walk down the street, within seconds, I'm making an assumption about that person. Not
uh-huh,
because I'm a bad person, not because I'm evil, because I'm a human being that exists in the world,
yeah,
right? We
yeah,
all do. It's our bias, right? That's part of being human, right? So the problem here is not that we are different. That's literally, again, being human. But the problem is that the value that we ascribe to difference is the thing that causes harm often. And that value is often linked to that which we can see before I've even said hello to another person. So before I know anything about you, before I know your background, your beliefs, if you have children or not, if you, whatever, before I've know anything, my brain is already making an assumption, right? So we have to sit in the discomfort of what that means for us. So it's important for us to do that, because if we don't pause, it's almost like a hamster in a wheel. And if you don't put a cog in that wheel and stop that wheel, it will continue running. So if I don't stop myself and ask myself, what is my relationship with how I view other people and difference in the world? And where am I ascribing value judgments unfairly towards someone else based on simply what I can see? And where is that causing harm and perpetuating a system of inequality? If I don't stop asking myself those questions, I remain part of the problem. And that's true for all people, right? Because the system that we've inherited from apartheid and colonialism is not going to change if we don't start recognizing the role that we play in it. And the role that we play in it is often as simple as this. Let me give you an example of something that I hate acknowledging, but that it's the truth. Because of the world that I live in, because of the media that I consume, despite my best intention, when I'm walking alone in the street and I see, as an example, a Black man, automatically I hold my handbag tighter, right? Why do I do that? Because all the messaging in the world around me has taught me that I need to be afraid of someone that looks that way. And in that moment, I need to pause. I need to put a cog in that wheel and be like, what are you doing? Is this valid? How can you actively challenge your thinking in this moment and understand that the difference that you're seeing is the thing that you're unfairly ascribing a value judgment to this person? And is this really necessary in this moment? And what are you basing your value judgment on? Is it simply because of the way that this person looks, or are you genuinely in danger? Because more often than not, I've been taught to respond in a particular way. Because the thing is, our problematic beliefs, which all people have, by the way, is often something that's not necessarily taught, but caught in the way that the world works, right? In the way that we consume media, in the way that things are directly and indirectly said. Because very often, how we cause the most harm is not in overt ways, but in covert ways. So the ways that the social system, just the unquestioned social norms that we all just kind of expect. Yeah, it's okay to just lock your doors when you get to the robot because, you know, those people look dodgy. Or, you know, it's okay to look the other way when you see someone suffering. It's okay to just normalize suffering in South Africa, as an example, especially if the person looks a particular way. Then it's easy for me to judge that person, as an example. So it's important because we have to acknowledge that we don't treat all differences the same, right? Some differences that we see, we have value judgments that we ascribe to that particular person and what it is that we can see, and that is unfair. I hope that made sense.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I get it totally.
Yeah.
So I think to sum it up, this particular question, we need to actively challenge our thinking. We've been raised a
Yes.
certain way, and like you're saying, the media feeds us a certain narrative, and we take that narrative and we make it real in our lives, you know. And so now, when you walk into a shop, the security guard follows the black lady with the big handbag because you
Ah,
know that's how it is, but it should not be that's how it is, you know.
mhm.
Those that hold the power should be asking themselves the question, you know, why do we think that you know, a certain person carrying a handbag in a shop is about to steal something? So I totally
Absolutely.
get what you're saying.
And
um
also, sorry if I jump on what you just said, you know, every time I do any work around diversity with
mm,
any group of people, diverse group of people, if there's any woman of color in
mm,
the room, I would
mm.
ask the question, when last were you asked where something is in a grocery shop, as an example?
I'm asked all
And
the
there's
time.
exactly,
Yesterday.
right? Exactly. I've never been asked, right? So what is the value judgment we ascribe to the body? You know what I mean? Like these things
Yeah.
aren't, it's not like, I
We
believe
don't
no
speak
one wakes
about
up in
these
the
things.
morning.
Mm.
Exactly, but no one wakes up in the morning and say, "Oh, I can't wait to be discriminating towards someone else today." Like no one does that. But if we don't question the things that we automatically do, we will keep on being part of the problem.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
You need to halt. You need to halt and
exactly.
then, okay, why am I thinking that? Before I say anything, why am I thinking that that lady works here? Because I think, yeah, I think it would really allow us to be more open, to have more conversations, about these things. I sometimes answer back when a white lady asks me, like, where are the tomatoes? And I say, excuse me, ma'am, but I do not work here. I'm here as a customer like yourself. And then it's a whole big apology. And yeah. So thank you for bringing that to light as well. What would you say are the challenges that we face as South Africans? I think that you've already, in a sense, answered this. That really inhibit us to apply diversity and inclusion within our organizations, particularly because I think that's the space that you do work in. In corporates.
I think I'm going to answer this question through my lens, which is a subjective one. But what I see and because of the people that still hold the most power, again, not because they're bad people, just because of our historical context, I think that we think that when we have these conversations honestly, it says something about our, if I can say it bluntly, like goodness. Like it's almost like we want to defend that we are good people. And my need and deep desire to not be seen as a bad person is stronger than the one to like really genuinely want to change and genuinely want to like, because that's the thing, right? You have to almost like work through the discomfort of what it really means to exist in this unequal
Yeah.
society to get to an inclusive one. And that discomfort often means that, like I said before, you have to acknowledge how you participate in the system. And I think often those with more power don't want to be confronted with the fact that they play an active role in the system, because they might think that that means that they caused it. You know what I mean? And it's the same if we think back to that question around reconciliation. I think typically a lot of white South Africans, and I see this in myself all the time, I'm not any better. We often steer away from these conversations because we think just simply being part of a conversation around genuine equality would mean somehow that I need to take responsibility for the entire apartheid, and I will basically have to, acknowledge that I am the greatest sinner and I caused this entire system, right? As opposed to just taking responsibility for my slice of the pie and actually owning up to, you know what I mean? Like genuinely just taking that responsibility, being empathetic, being genuine, being humble, as opposed to, you understand what I mean? So I think it
Absolutely.
requires sitting in that discomfort and being okay with what that means. But we are so desperate to want to prove that we are good people and that we didn't cause the problem, that we remain like active participants in it, right? So we all kind of exist in this system. But the truth is, like, I heard this metaphor once, which I really like using and I believe in. It's like we are all like teacups that's full to the brim. And the moment we put under pressure, tea will spill out, right? So the broken system that we live in, the one that is systemically, because of our history, we have deep inequality in this country. We have power imbalances that spills out within us when we put under pressure. That's why we still see deeply racist, as an example, incidents happening in this country. Why we still see students urinating on each other's laptops, right? Of course, those are extreme examples, but that's a system of our society that needs healing, right? We need that healing because when we put under pressure, the tea spills out, right? Then all of a sudden, racist or homophobic or sexist remarks come out, and we kind of don't know where that comes from. It's because we're not confronting the
The deep rooted, I
like,
would say,
yeah, exactly, like
wounds.
the
Yeah.
legacy that sits
Mm.
with all of us, the legacy that sits within me too, right? We're not confronting that, but it does come out when we put under pressure, which is part of being a human. If that makes sense.
Absolutely, Lydia. It does. What does representation mean? What is my responsibility if I'm sitting in a boardroom and there's no representation, and I can see it for myself. Am I to raise my voice and speak about the representation that is not visible? What is my role, and how do I use my voice?
I'm going to call a spade a spade. It's not the responsibility of the person with the least power to say something. It's always the responsibility of the person with the most power. So what I mean is, if it's an environment that's only white and there's one person of color, it's not that person's responsibility to educate everyone else. If it's an environment that's only male and there's one female, it's not the female's responsibility to educate everyone else. If it's an environment with one person that is disabled, it's not that person's responsibility to remind everyone of a wheelchair ramp. If there's one person that is of a different religion or whatever the case may be, we shouldn't put the responsibility on the person that is already having to, like I said, assimilate into a culture and a way of being that they don't necessarily feel as comfortable in, right? It's like this thing around, I mean, this conversation is now very race heavy. If we take it to gender, why do we leave the responsibility to women to educate us on women and child abuse? You know what I mean? Like, why do we do that? It should be the responsibility of men to fight that battle, not the responsibility of women. And it's the same in the boardroom. So if I feel underrepresented in the boardroom, technically it should be it shouldn't be my responsibility to speak up, right? And this is what we see so often in my work, so often, specifically because I work in the anti-racism space. Black people, especially Black females, would come to me and be like, I'm so tired that I always have to be the one that educates my colleagues. Why can't they see? Why can't they just open their eyes, right? So that's again why it's important to have conversations about difference, because if I have conversations about difference, then I cannot not see it anymore, right? So if my eyes have been opened, now I see it. Now I need to choose to do something about it, because these conversations can't purely remain intellectual. When I become aware of difference and of my responsibility, then I have to start speaking up. So as an example, if you are the only person of color in the room, it shouldn't be your responsibility. And if someone then in that space declares themselves as an ally or whatever the case may be, then you should call that person to account and say, hey, step up. I'm not going to speak up in the meeting. It's your responsibility. You said that you're the ally. You said you want change. Now's your time. Say something. But even that irritates me, because it should be the person with the most power, because with power comes responsibility. That's the only way that we're going to change.
I love that so much. I love that so much. And it's placing the responsibility, like you're saying, on the person that has the power, that has the ability to change things around, and not the one that is the minority within the room. Uh, the shift that needs to happen, this is my last question. I know that you need to leave us soon. The shift that needs to happen in our South African society when it comes to, proper reconciliation, inclusion, and diversity really happening, so that we come to a place where we no longer, Lydia, call you up and say, can we have a conversation about reconciliation and inclusion? Is that even possible, to have in a country such as South Africa? Maybe in years to come, are our children, is your little girls still going to be having these conversations? Um, I just want to know, like, what does it look like, and what is the responsibility if we don't want to continually have this issue?
Hmm. This is a difficult one because there's so much that I want to say, but okay. I think absolutely it's possible. Otherwise, I would not have been doing this for a living if I didn't believe that it is. Realistically, I think that my baby girl will hopefully also have to play her part. I don't think that this is
Every
something that will
generation.
just change overnight. I think I always like to use the analogy of not to sound like Depro, but like being an alcoholic as an example, right? If you're an alcoholic, then you remain one forever. You realize you have an issue, you realize you have an addiction that you need to pay attention to, and you need to actively choose sobriety every day, right? So if we genuinely want to work towards reconciliation in this country, it needs to be a conscious decision that we make. And very importantly, it needs to be one that we continue working on. Just like an alcoholic goes to an AA meeting, needs that support structure, continuously works on themselves, and daily chooses to remain sober, right? In the same way, we have to acknowledge that the system of 400 years in this country has an impact on all of us. The legacy, unfortunately, is 100% still alive and well. So let's forget about government failure. Let's forget about all of that. Let's look literally only at what is it that I can do in my life. What I can do is I can take responsibility in terms of my own actions. I can choose to see difference and I can choose to be affected by it. Don't ignore it. Be affected by it. See the difference, see the unfairness, see the injustice, and be affected by it. Because if I'm affected by it, I would want to do something.
Mm,
Don't
mm,
choose to not see. See and feel what that feels like, right? Understand that that's a daily choice that you have to make basically until the day you die. It's not something that that's what I always say to clients. You don't get someone in to go on an inclusion journey with you and then you're done.
mm,
It's a daily choice because the system has been set up by design for it to be easy for the power balance to remain in place.
mm,
If we want to break that down, we have to take personal agency and we have to take that every single day. Of course, that does include keeping government to account. So I don't want to say forget and don't keep them responsible, hold them responsible. That's a very big part of it, of actual personal agency, but that's a different conversation. I'm not going to go there now, but choose to see difference, choose to be affected by what you see, and make that daily commitment
mm,
because that means working towards reconciliation. That means taking up responsibility. That means playing your part in a restitution as well. And of course, that looks different for all of us because some of us have more and less power, and it's not all race related. It has to do with, like I mentioned, all of these different identity
oh
markers
yeah.
that make us people. All of that plays a part in terms of how much power we hold in society, and those are the things that we need to start actively feeling.
Mm,
That's what I say. Like, I always say, like, don't just have an intellectual conversation, have an
mm,
embodied experience.
mm. Sure. Lydia, thank you so, so, so much. I hear what you're saying. Let us be active participants, in the change that we want to see in this country when it comes to reconciliation, inclusion, and diversity. And don't just sit back and have a conversation about it and say, oh, well, that's how it is, but actively do something about it in the space that you find yourself in. Thank you so so much. May the Lord bless
Pleasure.
the work of your hands. Thank you for being brave, pioneering, and being courageous. I know that the space that you're in is a difficult space, because it's difficult conversations that need to be had and necessary conversations. But thank you for leading it for South Africa, and we hope that many more will come into the space and bring about proper change for all South Africans. So thank you so much. Really appreciate you, and all the best. For the
Thank
year
you so
ahead,
much.
2024, and all the best for tomorrow. Have yourself a good Passover weekend. Thank you.
You too. You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Oh, there you go, family. There you go. It is always interesting to have conversations with people that are in their chosen careers and spaces and that are really impactful and making a difference because that's ultimately what it is about. As Lydia has already alluded and said, very clearly that it is about personal agency. It's about personal